fantastic to have Professor Kent Roach here today. He is releasing a book, or has released a book called Canadian Policing, Why and How It Must Change. He spoke on a panel last night about some of the issues that come up in the book with the Chief of the Winnipeg Police. I know some of you were there. And Mike Kopak, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister for Public Safety. It was a fantastic event. So that was really great. And Kent is going to talk to you about his book today. That was just shortlisted for the Vasily Prize for Public Policy Books, which is a fantastic achievement. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Kent Roach.
Thank you very much. And can people hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, it's wonderful to be back here at Robson Hall. I'd like to recognize that this is Orange Shirt Day. I brought my orange shirt, but to wear tomorrow because we don't have a statutory holiday in Ontario. But I would like to acknowledge Orange Shirt Day and also that we're on the traditional lands of the Cree, the OG Cree, the Métis, and other indigenous people that have called Turtle Island their home, and I'm grateful to be able to live and also learn from indigenous people on this land. I'm going to kind of take you through the whole book today, but also leave some time for questions. So this is in some ways kind of the Reader's Digest book. I've worked on policing for quite a bit of my career. I was on the Research Advisory Committee for the Ipperwash inquiry that involved a police killing of Dudley George, an unarmed Anishinaabe protester. I worked on Arar and Air India inquiries that involved policing, and also was able to serve on the Canadian Council of Academies expert panels, both on the future of policing and on policing in Indigenous communities. And the Canadian Council of Academies is not as well known as it should, but it's a wonderful organization that is tasked by the federal government to examine policy issues, not to make the same kind of recommendations that, say, a public inquiry makes, but to make recommendations based on the state of the knowledge. So it's often tasked with scientific questions, but because the federal government knows, although they don't necessarily always do something about it, that policing is both, increasing in costs and also does not seem to be getting the results or the measurable results. They tasked the council to look at it at these issues twice. And so I got to spend a lot of time not only with full-time academics who have made policing their career research project, but also with former police chiefs and former Indigenous police officers. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I started the book after around the time of George Floyd. Now, I'm going to show a couple of pictures next, and I'm just going to give you a kind of a warning that they're distressing because they do show people that are no longer with us and people who have been victims of police violence. I do this just because the book really starts out with looking at what happened in Canada in June of 2020. So as you know, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, not all that far from here, in late May of 2020. And I think that there's a real sense in Canada that, at least we're not as bad as the U.S., especially the U.S. in the era of Trump. And part of the reasons why I'm writing kind of books more for a popular audience, not that many people buy them, but is to kind of dispel or to do my bit to try to dispel this sense of Canadian complacency and or superiority. So the kind of opening chapter after the introduction is it just looks at what happened in Canada in the month of June 2020. And it was unfortunately a very bloody month. So the person on the left-hand side is the late Chantal Moore, an indigenous mother who was living in a small New Brunswick town. She was shot to death by a city police officer. It turned out that the knife she had was a steak knife, and because New Brunswick doesn't have a kind of special independent investigation unit, they called in Quebec's special investigation unit, and they eventually decided that the police officer, there were no reasonable grounds to lay charges against the police officer. There has been an inquest in both of these deaths. The man on I'm going to get confused now. The man on your left is Rodney Levy, who was shot and killed by an RCMP officer in a small New Brunswick community. And at his inquest, they heard evidence about a former RCMP band constable program that would allow persons from his community, that had allowed persons from his community to be kind of auxiliary RCMP members. And one of the former band constable said that he was pretty confident, because they knew Mr. Levy, that they could have talked him down. But he was shot when he had knives in both hands and didn't drop them. In fairness, I don't think Chief Smythe has concerns that not everything in the book is fair. I should mention, in both of these cases, the police officers had been positioned in a manner where they didn't have an obvious route of escape or backing off. So that's, and if you read the New Brunswick Attorney General's public decision not to prosecute in these cases, they're up on the web, which I think is good. That transparency is good. You'll see that in both of those cases, there is reliance on a dicta, I think it's in paragraph 25 of the 2010 Nesgalowick case from the Supreme Court of Canada, which is, police officers have a difficult job. We don't hold them to a standard of perfection. And of course, one of the reasons why, as a criminal lawyer, I'm a bit skeptical about relying on criminal law to regulate police behavior is I believe that, whether you're a police officer or not, you should benefit from the right to silence. If you have the determination to exercise it, you should benefit from the reasonable doubt principle. And as a citizen, I feel like I have a right to expect better behavior from the police than not violating the criminal code. Now, that's not to say that I think we should abolish those special investigation units, but I also think we shouldn't be surprised when, as is often the case, they decide there is no reasonable prospect for conviction. This, as you know, is Chief Alan Adam, who was grounded by a second officer who responded to a call in a Fort McMurray casino parking lot. You can see the damage that was done with the grounding. Grounding is a police tactic that is used. I've heard concerns in Ontario from Jerry McNeely, the former OIPRD, kind of your version of LIRA director, about the amount of grounding that's going on. And the last that I knew, this was being investigated by Alberta's somewhat beleaguered Special Investigations Unit. And I've seen no public resolution whether the RCMP officer who grounded Chief Adam is going to be charged. And I also say Chief Adam because this is a very respected person in his community. I believe he's met with Bishop Tutu and people like that. And so, you know, sometimes when there are concerns about racism, some people say, well, isn't this really class, right? And I think in this case, you know, again, perhaps not. This is DeFonte Miller and Constable Theriault. This didn't happen in June 2020, but Constable Theriault was found guilty. He was an off-duty police officer who chased and was responsible for the eye injury here. And then this was clips from a small town in Nunavut, policed by the RCMP, which shows this man who is in Inuk being knocked down by an open RCMP cruiser. It actually even gets worse. After this happened, this man is arrested for public intoxication and is put into a cell where he is severely beaten by another prisoner in the cell, so much that he has to be airlifted from the small community that's name escapes me now to Iqaluit for medical attention. Okay. Last of the glory, the triggering pictures. So we have problems of over-policing, of which all of these are arguably examples. Last night I talked a little bit about the CBC Deadly Encounters database, which is up on the web. It's not perfect, but it is the best that we have, with over 500 deaths, not all police shootings. Some are deaths in police custody. And if any of you are doing research, it's a kind of good starting point, because you can search by race of the victim, you can search by police force, and there are thumbnail sketches as well as, I think quite importantly, where possible, photographs of the deceased. So we have over-policing, but then we also have under-policing. Now, one of the other things that happened during June of 2020 is Toronto's first black police chief, Mark Saunders, left policing, and it was quite a surprise. And one of the things that he told the media as he was leaving is he wanted to leave policing to do something about young black men killing young black men. And this is something that, if you live in Toronto, you know happens on an all too frequent basis. And, you know, frankly, those of us who are not black are often understandably reluctant to talk about it. But it just struck me as kind of sad that he didn't feel that being police chief of Toronto was the right thing to do something about that. So even someone who has spent his career in policing and is, the chief operating officer in charge of one of our largest police forces, even he seemed to be kind of expressing much of that mood that was surrounding the defunding post-George Floyd movement. So one of the ideas is we've known for a long time that there is over-policing and what used to be called under-policing. I think now the better phrase, which I hope I use somewhat, I've got to change that, is under-protection. So in the book I use the word under-protection. But we don't always put these two things together, right? So we don't always put together the fact that 30% of prisoners are indigenous, 50% of federal women prisoners are indigenous, with missing and murdered indigenous women. But the problem is that the bad relations and fear of the police that is created by over-policing, I think arguably contributes to lack of knowledge, sometimes lack of cooperation with the community that contributes to underprotection. And I think a lot of us have known this for a long time about Indigenous people, but I was really kind of astounded when I was working with Justice Epstein in her review of missing persons stemming from the MacArthur serial killing, is that you can find the same phenomenon among the LGBTQ2S community. So in Toronto, at least, the memories of over-policing, often on a kind of morality sort of basis with the bathhouse raids or even more recent events, has led to distrust among the LGBTQ2S community and the police. And that may have played a role with respect to the delayed missing persons investigations with respect to racialized gay men who went missing from Toronto's gay village. And so I think this idea of the vicious circle, which Justice Epstein talks about and is also talked about in the Thunder Bay Broken Trust report, is actually very helpful. So it isn't just, again, a kind of class-based, of course, we know poor people are more likely to be victims of crime, and they may also be overrepresented in prison. But it actually gets to the fact that if you're scared of the police because of your identity, then you're going to be distrustful of the police when you arguably need help from the police. Okay, so the next chapter is, and I'm just trying to see what the time is. David, what's...
It's 20 after.
20 after, okay. So the next chapter was kind of fun to write because I have to say late in my career, I am becoming a kind of skeptic about a lot of things that lawyers do. So maybe I chose the wrong career. So
It's not too late, Ken. It's not too late.
Yeah. But speaking to law students, this is also or lawyers. Policing and you're fortunate enough to have a policing course given at this faculty. We don't have one at Toronto. And if I go back after my sabbatical, I may try to offer one. But there's a lot of lawyering jobs in policing. So that's kind of the good news. The bad news is I could find really no evidence that the increased legalization of policing is improving policing for the community. So the good news is lots of jobs in what I would call the after-the-fact accountability legal industry that has grown up. Bad news from a citizen's perspective, not clear that this is actually improving policing. So I think it's Robert Christmas, who's I asked Chief Smythe, he's still with the Winnipeg Police Service, has written a very good book on Canadian policing, published I think by Gil Queens, maybe 2000, I don't know. Sometime in the 2000s. And he talks about this as quadruple jeopardy. And that is, if a police officer does something bad, then it can be subject to criminal investigation, you can be sued, you can be disciplined, or you can be the subject of charter. And all of these things can happen. One does not exclude the other, right? So there is no double jeopardy. So, we're investing heavily in after-the-fact accountability. And I think the main message of the book is not that we should abandon that, because I think in some ways that is necessary to maintain the most basic idea of the rule of law. That is, the police, if they act illegally, should be, that they lose their official authority for acting, and there should be findings and consequences for doing so. But the main message of the book, and this relates to use of force, is that if we don't if we don't change the rules and try to prevent policing, misconduct or undesired outcomes like fatalities, if police-involved fatalities, we will. We're only looking at half the picture, right? And especially if these 4 accountability devices often end in either no finding of liability or no personal consequences for the police officer who is involved. So we're investing massively, and largely lawyers are doing this, in after-the-fact accountability, whereas in my view, we're not spending enough time discussing whether ex ante we have the appropriate policies, education, and training for the police, right? So if you were there last night, you would have heard a debate between Chief Smythe and myself about use of force policies, right? But there was, I think, some agreement on the panel that we can't just rely on SIU independent investigations, because as I showed, everything, that there were no consequences with respect to Rodney Levy and Chantel Moore and many others. So you got the criminal law, then you have civil lawsuits. So there's a range of torts, like the tort of negligent investigation, the tort of misfeasance in office, and so on. But again, and this hooks into some of my work on remedies, even if they're successful, it doesn't necessarily mean that the police behavior is going to change for the better. Because the money, often the money for the lawyers are paid either by the police board or the police union. There may be insurance, and these are still rare, sporadic events. Public complaints. Again, public complaints are theoretically a good idea, right? Because if a police officer arrests me and unnecessarily strip searches me and finds nothing, and I'm not prosecuted, I can't go to court to get a stay of proceedings or exclusion of evidence under the charter. I could maybe bring a civil lawsuit, but I'd be worried about having to pay the costs of the police if I'm unsuccessful. So maybe I should go to police complaints and at least say, look, why was I arrested or strip searched without following the appropriate rules? And if you read the Ontario version of LIRA, the OIPRD, they have this report called Breaking the Golden Rule. And I was counsel for Aboriginal Legal Services in Golden in 2001. And, we thought we had won a pretty big victory, 5-4, in saying you don't get to strip search persons unless you have reasonable and probable grounds that they have a weapon or you're going to find evidence. And indeed, some police forces, like the Ottawa, seem to cut down on strip searches. Toronto, however, didn't. And Toronto, I think there's a part in the book where, I think the number of people strip searched from Toronto could fill the Skydome. Now, maybe some of those were justified, but what the Breaking the Golden Rule report does is it indicates how people continue, Toronto police especially, continue to conduct strip searches in violation of Golden, despite 80 reported decisions finding charter violations. Right? So, again, I think this is legal education is partly to blame because we tend to teach Golden like it's the rules, right? But the rules don't necessarily, are not necessarily followed. And if I'm a police officer and there is evidence excluded, I may not even find out about that depending on when I actually give testimony. And there may be consequences for that, but there may not be consequences for it. So, and there was a similar study done by the RCMP, Civilian Review and Complaints Board, finding widespread non-compliance within RCMP divisions with Golden. Some were not collecting the necessary materials, the necessary information, so they don't even, can't really say how many strip searches they are. And some divisions didn't understand Golden. And, one of the problems is we now rely upon the Supreme Court to regulate police conduct. And any of you who've taken criminal procedure know that a lot of those cases are confusing for lawyers to read. So the idea that they're going to be communicated accurately and in an up-to-date manner to the police is largely illusory. And many American scholars have also reached this conclusion, right? So the Americans invested heavily in judicial regulation of police conduct before we did. We've kind of followed that pattern, and it doesn't seem to be improving policing in either country. And so many people will look, and I make an argument that we should look to the UK, the PACE Acts, the Code of Practice, College of Policing, which is a different methodology. Now, I'm not saying that is perfect, and certainly there are some things under PACE and the codes of practice that provide kind of 50 pages about how you should do interrogations, and how you should do identifications, and so on. I'm not saying that's perfect, but I'm saying that at least we could debate. If we didn't like a code of practice that came out under the criminal code, we can go to Parliament and say we don't think this is good enough. But as it is now, it really depends on each individual court. They may find a violation, but not exclude the evidence, not stay. That's got to dilute the regulatory power of the judicial decision. And so, partly, I think Parliament has largely abdicated regulating police conduct to the courts and are relying on the courts to enforce the charter. And again, I think I'm enough of a, I believe in the charter. I'd rather live in a country with the charter than without. But again, I think as a citizen, I sometimes want police behavior that is better than the charter minimum, right? The charter minimum is important. It should be there. But what about more prophylactic rules? What about rules about interrogating people who may have mental cognitive issues and stuff that's really not captured by the courts? The next thing is, what about police discipline? And it seems to me that in police discipline, we get both the remnants of a paramilitary model and a quasi-criminal model. This is particularly the case in Ontario, where you don't even have the balance of probability standards. The police unions have successfully fought with the Ford government to retain a kind of higher than balance of probabilities. And I talk about Nathan Parker, who is a notorious police officer in Niagara Falls, Niagara Regional, who has, been involved in multiple incidents, including a shooting, or he was shot by another officer who was, it's a mess. But the long and short of it is, he's still, to my knowledge, a police officer. And a lot of the sanctions for disciplines are docking days off, temporary ban on promotion. I'm not sure that that necessarily promotes public confidence. And I do think we need to, and this was discussed last night, think of more of a regulated profession model tied to continuing and remedial education. Again, that may not be perfect, but I think it is better than what we have now, which is often police officers defended by lawyers, paid by the union, who really often litigate these matters like it was a criminal trial, and with sanctions that, yes, can include removal from the force in some cases, but also a lot of other sanctions that are not necessarily ones that hold up to public confidence. So this slide really says much of what I've already said. One of the things that Justice Tulloch said in Ontario is we have this kind of police accountability, quadruple jeopardy, lots of different cogs going on. We need to think of it more as tied into policing policies. And as I say again, how many people have to die because they don't drop knives? Maybe in some cases there is no alternative, but I have a hard time accepting that we're doing an adequate job of looking at those alternatives, even though we do spend time looking at each individual case. So why do we not spend enough time thinking about ex ante rules to govern police conduct as opposed to ex post accountability mechanisms? Well, here I argue that there's a fundamental undergovernance of the police. It starts with this idea, which unfortunately has been if anything, gaining force recently with some of the controversies over mass casualty and also with some of the government's positioning during the February convoy, that police should be independent, should have, quote, operational independence. To me, that's a very, very dangerous concept. Why? Because almost everything that the police do could be said to be operational, right? And what about the policy of police operations? So this idea that you leave the police essentially to self-govern. Now the police will say we don't self-govern, we have 4 different accountability mechanisms crawling on our backs. And they're right. But to what extent does the Minister of Public Safety tell the RCMP Commissioner what to do? Well, we don't know, because ministerial directives are not public. While I started writing this book, I did an ATIP request for all ministerial directives. I'm still waiting now in almost October 2022 to get that request. So those directives should be published, subject to legitimate secrecy concerns. And the minister should not, every time he or she does something and tells the commissioner what to do, should not be subject to politicized claims of political interference. Now, you might be saying, oh, Professor Roach, you're going crazy. What about police independence? Well, police independence is a common law concept, maybe a constitutional concept now, maybe. You never know with Section 7. But to me, it goes back to, we don't want politicians saying to police, investigate my enemies, don't investigate my friends, right? We can all accept that that would become a police state if that was allowed. But if the police get to have complete operational autonomy, we also have another kind of police state. That's the police state where the police essentially govern themselves. And, it may be, right? I mean, there's a lot of dedicated people, and I include Chief Smythe in this. I'm a fan. That restrain the police. But what if you don't have a Chief Smythe, right? So you always, I think as lawyers we have to think about, we know that who is in charge matters. And, we may have generally good police leadership, but in a democracy, right, you have to have politically responsible people so that you can go, whether it's to a responsible minister or to a municipal council, who in Winnipeg, the municipal council used to govern the Winnipeg police. Now we have a police service board. I hear there's been debates about increasing provincial appointees. In many provinces you have a mix of provincial and municipal appointees. But there needs, I think, to be some democratic link where I, as a citizen, can go to someone that I theoretically can say, I'm not going to vote for you next time, and say, I think, the police should do something differently. Not in terms that I think the police should investigate Davy Ireland, although that would obviously be,
for example,
a good idea. But that, I think the police should have a different attitude towards policing public protests. Now, this doesn't mean, right, and this goes back to some of my work on democratic dialogue, this doesn't mean that I will always be happy with a more democratic approach to policing, right? Because I don't agree with all politicians, and I'm going to have to be active about making sure that I get out to vote and that I criticize, and but I think, right, policing is too important to be left simply to the police. Okay, so now we're in about chapter 6 of chapter 10. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on policing costs are not sustainable. But as you know, police officers make, on average, over $100,000 a year. My oldest daughter is a mental health nurse. She doesn't make that much. I think, hopefully she won't be mad at me saying that. But, you know, and we also know that when they decided to arm the CBSA, the border security people, it cost, I think, $700 million to arm the 5,000 CBSA officers. Because not only do you have to buy them the guns and the ammunition, but you got to train them and certify them. But the problem is, right, and again, as I said last day, I'm not a police abolitionist. I'm not, you know, I have reservations about defunding. But what I worry about is police are one of the few essential services where they have adequacy standards that could limit budget cuts. And you saw this in Alberta when both Mayor Iveson and Mayor Neshi, both gone now, after the George Floyd defunding, started to say, well, maybe we should think about doing things a little bit different, you know, detasking the Edmonton and Calgary police. Well, what did then Minister of Justice Casey Madhu say? He kind of gave them a warning and said, one, I don't like this, you know, police defunding idea. Fair enough, that's a legitimate position for a politician to have. But he also said, if they really take away from the budget of their police, then we as a province have responsibility for determining the adequacy of police in each jurisdiction. And theoretically, we could take over a police force that is not up to our sufficiency standards. And the sufficiency standards vary from province to province, but you know, we don't have provincial adequacy standards for schools, health, housing budgets. So, you know, my concern is, as we're likely going into what may be a long-term recession and trying to recover from the deficits that were caused by the pandemic, we may be in a situation where all public budgets are going to be cut, but the police budget is going to be a little bit protected, both because of adequacy standards and also because of public fear. So we may actually be moving in the opposite direction to detasking, which, you know, again, as I get older, I don't like to be this pessimistic, but, you know, anyway. So, you know, police defunding has had limited success in Canada. Part of the reason is the police, like law schools or universities, almost all of the budget, or a great deal of the budget, is salaries and benefits. So, you know, what do you do? If you start doing police layoffs, the police are going to be even less diverse than they are now. We know the police doesn't look like the rest of Canada. I think 12% visible minority, maybe 4% indigenous, 22% women. If you start laying off police, then what happens? If you start doing hiring freezes. So it's hard politically and legally, because of adequacy standards, to reduce police budgets. Okay, so everything's kind of down. Chapter 7, can things get better? Well, there's a lot of consensus now that we need to move to a multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach to community safety. And here, I recently learned that the Bear Clan idea in Anishinaabe teachings the Bear Clan, people of the Bear Clan, I've been told, and please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, have expertise in both peacekeeping and medicine. Well, you know what? The whole move to community safety, and especially the idea of combining mental health professionals with policing, we're finally catching up to the wisdom of the Bear Clan approach. So Ontario now requires community safety and well-being plans. I predict that Manitoba will follow, not because I'm an Ontario imperialist, but policing legislation like the SIU often starts in Ontario and then goes throughout Canada. It's a good idea, but it's an unfunded mandate. And so I looked at the first community safety and well-being plans produced by Canadian cities, and I wasn't too impressed because a lot of them didn't seem to have a lot of active police involvement. They were long on rhetoric, short on plans, and almost all of them said, we got to do something about housing. And housing is not even included. So essentially you're putting an unfunded mandate on municipalities and regions to come up with something that makes sense in theory, but that they don't have the resources to manage. Whereas you've got the police, even though they participate in these community safety and well-being plans, which are developed by the municipal or regional council, you still have the police over in their comfortable silo where they report to the police service board and their budget is subject to adequacy standards. So I'm not surprised that although some police leaders say, and I think believe, that they need to work in partnership, when push comes to shove, they're still in their own kind of silos. And are we training police officers to work well with social workers or community activists? Probably not. So, I mean, it's a great idea, but how do you meaningfully break down the silos? Two more chapters. Policing Indigenous communities. Those of you who were there last night, this was well discussed by my co-panelists. I agreed 100% with both of what they said. That right now we have a joint federal-provincial funding model. So if you want a self-administered police service in an Indigenous community, you have to get the feds and the province and your own community to sign on. A very tough thing. After Rodney Levy, the RCMP, even though the coroner's inquest recommended reinstating the band constable, they said, no, we're not going to do it. So, I mean, Indigenous police services are going to have to work with the RCMP. And of course, under the federal provincial, you can also have an agreement with the RCMP for enhanced policing. But again, because the RCMP is so strained, most of that is not working. And many people working for Indigenous police services are not Indigenous, and they're using, often may be attracted to the higher benefits of policing with municipal force. And now the Mounties have their first collective agreement, kind of a necessary catch-up. They'll also be attracted, perhaps, to the Mounties. And so the federal government has said they're going to recognize policing as an essential service. But one of my concerns is what is that legislation, which we still haven't seen introduced or even a draft, is that going to be flexible enough to allow Indigenous communities to do their own Bear Clan or other stuff when it comes to community safety? Or is it going to be focused on making Indigenous police services just like non-Indigenous police services? And this is partly the dilemma of equality and difference, is that, you know, if I'm in an Indigenous police service, in some ways I want to have all of the equipment that the non-Indigenous police service has. But if we go back to governance, if the community is saying, well, no, we actually don't want you to have tasers. We want you to work with elders. To me, that's legitimate for the community to say, that's what we're going to do. And of course, you know, there's not one approach to Indigenous policing, just like there's not one approach to any other kind of policing. So democratic policing means experiments. It means change. Hopefully it means evaluation, and it means public debate within the community being policed about what we want the police to do and what hard choices we're all going to have to make about limited budgets that can be devoted to community safety. Right? So it may be in an older community, the police say, you know, we want to invest in cybercrime because most of our old folks, like me, are sitting home on our computers getting ripped off by hackers. You know, so I mean, again, it's something that needs to be democratic. And then finally, what do we do with the RCMP? You know, I actually feel for the RCMP. As I say in the book, I grew up for a time, just before I wanted to be a catcher for the Montreal Expos, I wanted to be an RCMP officer. And my parents, who are shorter than me, lied to me and said, "Oh, sure, you'll be 6 feet," because that was the requirement. So that may explain a lot of the kind of George Costanza bitterness that people detect in me. So you know, exit from contract policing, I think is legitimate. Surrey has done it, lots of controversy. The Sitka Nation, just very recently, are doing it after they've gotten some land claim money. So, you know, there is a federal subsidy. The RCMP union is defending contract policing, which involves, I think, close to 15,000 Mounties. So the bulk of Mounties are now in contract policing, is defending it on the basis of the federal subsidy. If I was the federal minister, I would say, I will facilitate exit where the community wants, and I will try to make it cost neutral. I don't think we should just defend contract policing on the basis of the federal subsidy. I think we need to look at RCMP governance. The advisory, the management advisory board, it has not become an active role. You know, it could be a national police service board that could feed into the minister. The Yukon Police Council is, I think, the best innovation that I've seen, in that the RCMP division in the Yukon is subject to the direction from the Yukon Police Council, which includes the Deputy Minister of Justice, as well as 3 nominees from First Nations in the Yukon. So we need to think about something like that. Nova Scotia, on paper, has robust advisory committees for the RCMP in the Nova Scotia Police Act, but what we're hearing from the Mass Casualty Commission is they're not working, and that there were concerns about the level of policing received in Colchester County, and I talk about this in the book, before the massacre that started in that county. And, you know, I worry that the Mass Casualty Commission may be a missed opportunity if they don't kind of think about what the proper mix between contract policing and local policing should be in Canada going forward. They have both a federal and a provincial mandate where they can actually examine this, and I don't think they have devoted sufficient time. I've also, and I said this publicly to them in a recent roundtable, they are going with the idea of RCMP operational independence. which I think is a mistake that will lead to more undergovernance of the RCMP, and I do not think is required in order to respect the legitimate ambit of police independence. So, even if they somehow magically withdrew from contract policing, local policing, federal policing is also still a bit of a mess. We have money laundering issues, we have national security issues, and there are concerns that the national policing mandate has suffered. I think there should be a minister just for the RCMP. I think the public safety portfolio is too broad, and in Australia they have that. And we need democratic debate. But I'm very concerned that we're moving backwards. If we continue to talk about operational independence, I'm concerned that the Civilian Review Agency, which has done some good systemic work, including in its investigation of the Baptiste family's complaint about the investigation of Colton Bushey's death. I mean, I have some issues, but it was good that they've done that work. I worry that under Bill C-20, they're going to be overburdened when they have 5,000 CBSA officers. So, where do we go? Last chapter, I suggest the treaties have some of the answers, maintain peace and good order, and aid and assist. I think whatever approach is taken to indigenous policing should be informed by those words in most of the number of treaties. I also would not abandon Sir Robert Peel's principles, which maybe didn't come from Sir Robert Peel. There's a historical dispute about that. But do have a civilian idea of policing that minimizes force and says the police is the public. But never forget that in Canada, our model of policing has not been the Peel Bobbies. It has been the Red Surge, which is taken from the military. And in fact, there used to be an Alberta Provincial Police. Some people want there to be another Alberta Provincial Police. But when I was reading a historian's book on it, the first thing that happened when they had the Alberta Provincial Police is they gave them blue uniforms, like Peel's Bobbies. And they got really upset, had a tantrum, and ended up with red uniforms. So again, kind of an undergovernance of the police, right? I think you need to have a democratic authority that says, I know you want to wear red, but it's in the public interest for you to wear blue, and on an awful lot of other operational issues. So I'm sorry if I've gone over, but that's the book in the nutshell, so I guess you don't have to buy it now.
Kent, thank you very much.